is Billy McBride. I'm going to go through this catalog of my books. Before I make the book, I'm going to call something like Book Catalog 2. It's going to include descriptions of all these books that I have written over the past decade or so. So, the first card here says that there are 243 books. So I'm just going to go through them in alphabetical order and explain just some of what the books are about. The first book, 10 Failed Revolutionary Erotics. That was that's one of my books where there's just one sentence per page, and there's 100 pages, so there's 100 sentences or so. These are what I call kind of like collector's editions, because what I do is I write these books and then I'll condense them and then compile them into a compilation book. Okay, so this one was mostly a biographical book, just when I was in Hawaii, and I realized that what I did was take 10 authors and talk about them in terms of what they actually lost erotically, like, different ways. The next book, 60 different land projects. This actually was kind of a book where I substituted the terms from this next book that I had called 60 Different Writing Projects. No, actually it's in reverse. The 60 different land projects came first, and then the 60 different writing projects. This is mostly an experimental book, and this was the substitution for it, substituting terms. So they're very much alike, but this had to do with different versions of the Moat project that I was reconsidering, because the Moat project is started off as kind of like monuments around in a spiral to raise money for charity. And now I thought, well, if you can do like monuments, you can do like other things with moat and do them on land as sculptures or monuments in different ways. So those are what make up this 60 different land projects book. And the 16 different writing projects book is like that too. The next one, 254 state observations. You can see it. This dealt with a map I drew of Texas and allocated different observations for every county in Texas. But every county I would group I would group individual counties, say 5 or 6 or so, and that would make a state. So I had all 50 states in the 254 counties of Texas. I know that sounds kind of strange, but I'll put up the map or something one of these days that I did. And then I decided to just do some observations about every one of the states. And so that's that one. A Bird's Eye View of Moat, Spirals, and Shapes is a book that I wrote, which are the actual 254 spirals and the shapes that make up the monuments for those spirals. The spirals all have the same spiral shape, but the monuments are different, so it makes the spirals look different. And that was just illustrations. There wasn't any text in that book. Acus Not, a volume of sonnets, was kind of a recent book I did of about 80 or so, 88 sonnets, poems, and I really liked that book because I got a chance to write my, I don't want to say write my best, but I really did a good job with this, and they turned out really good. A poem, but this book right here is called Afraid. It's about a candle named Yellowtail, and it's a short, mostly actually it's more like a short story, but it's in a book form. And Afraid, he had well, a, a candle named Yellowtail, and he was on a mountain, and he got divorced by his wife, so he was kind of ranting about it or something like that. It was kind of funny. Imagination at work. All right. The next book is Afterlives. This book is one of the ones I detailed of the afterlives I know of, which are 14. Um, some of them I've been to on a Merkabah experience, so I have an experience of these afterlives. Actually, all of them I've been through. So that's 14 afterlives. And I wrote a little bit about each one of them, but it's not actually a good description in terms of a long description. These are just short, like in fragments about these afterlives. A Landscape for a Rain Shower. This is one of my favorite books. It really goes into detailing about different and new descriptions of a landscape where the way that the landscape is made up is it's not by scientific terms, it's mostly by imaginative terms on how that actual landscape was created, and then the rain and all, how that was created too. Kind of like in Hawaii, where you have the Menehue, or the little people that at nighttime they build the land up again. Well, this was kind of like that, except it's had different kind of it was written in a different way, and it's kind of a longer book actually. This one, A Little Reading, was another one of my collector's editions books where it's just about 100 lines really, but one sentence per page. I believe this is one of them. Uh, if not, it's even shorter, so it's like a sheaf. So A Little Reading, it dealt with some of the books I was reading in a certain time of my life, and how they all kind of cohere together at that time. Angels Always Win is a book. I don't think it's a long book at all. I think it's even shorter than a collector's edition. But this one has to do with uh, the game of spiritual golf, because they always win in spiritual golf against CEOs who also know how to play the game of spiritual golf, except everybody else on earth doesn't know how to play the game of spiritual golf. But they raise money for charity that way in this book. Angels and Arrows. It's kind of a compilation book of a few books that I wrote that were smaller. Um, so it was in also Hawaii that I wrote this book, and it's a good book, I would say. The Angels and Mammon. This is a collector's edition book. No, it's not. This is a compilation book of some very hard times that I went through uh, in my life, and the angels helped me pull through them. So I wrote about them. So it's a compilation of maybe 6 books that I fit together in these books. The Angels in Shapes, an Angelic Pull. Back when I discussed the bird's eye view of moats, um, of the moat monuments, uh, I was saying that there's 254 spirals and there's 254 shapes because each shape is repeated in the spiral. Well, an angelic pole is where the angels I um, decided to write down what they thought about the shapes in a different way. So each individual shape of the 252 is described by the angels in this book. Angels Bugging and the Dog. This is my first book on angels bugging, and it's written in 10 cantos. Um, the first 8 cantos or 7 cantos are written in terza rima style, like Dante. So it's rhyming 3 times each, and then it goes down in alternation. And then the dog part is actually a collection of poems that are tacked on to that at the end, about 80 poems actually. Angels Calling. Oh, and by the way, the Angels Bugging. It's written in 10 cantos, but it could have been a longer book. But I decided to cut it short. It really just went through about three, 3 or 4 of my angel wives, and then they were able to. I described what they do, and how they are, and what colors they represent, and how they how they relate to the Moat project. And I would have done more, and I might still do more on that. But this is I went on to other things. Angel's Calling is an illustration book of abstract art. Another Nobody is kind of an interesting book of poems where I would have six lines of poems, but I would pull some of the lines from other poems in that book too. So the first line might be the third line on a poem of the six further along down while you're reading the book. So I think that had about 100 um, poems in it, and that made it in that way. And it also had to do with the Map of Misreading, which was a book that critic Carol Bloom wrote. Um, a present from us. This might be one of my lost books. I don't really remember too much about this book, so I have to go back and like learn about it. Architectures. Um, it's kind of an experimental book, or sometimes I call them mystic books, books of mysticism. The way I wrote them was in a very experimental style about learning about architecture and language, how those two relate. Ariel on Kipling Street, she's a friend of mine who now is one of my angels. So she, or her astral self, is my angel, um, one of them. And just a little bit about writing about her um, and my life back in Houston in I think it's 1996 or so. Art and Anxiety is a book of relationships between Shakespeare and visual art, visual abstract art. And not only that, but also how two different adjectives that you can have at any moment in time can be Shakespearean and relate to one of Shakespeare's characters. So I gave some examples of them in this book. Art book is a book of art that I had made kind of a while back, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. A simple moat cue question and answer. This is talking about the moat project. It's very short, so it's shorter than a collector's edition. A Warning from the Angels is a book that I wrote. Um, Kind of the similar to a book I wrote called The Wonder and Love of MOAT Part 1 and 2. It deals a little bit more in depth of what the angels actually do, and the warning part was just like there are three sections: pre-moat, moat, and then post-moat, and the angels gave like some of the things that they don't like, that you shouldn't do, like to upset the angels. After describing some of the stuff that they did, how they operate in the moat project. Banana trees. Usually, with my studies, I study 5 texts, or maybe it's 6 texts, but one of the texts is Shakespeare twice because I study Hamlet. Okay, I study Hamlet, Shakespeare, and another play by Shakespeare, the Torah, the Iliad, Freud, the Bible, and Plato. So that's 6 or so. I don't know, but that's what I study in banana trees. I've been doing that for a long time, and seeing how all those relate to each other. Beauty in Progress is my second book that I wrote about 10 years ago, and it's kind of an ironic, almost sarcastic satire. Not really sarcastic, but and it also has a lot of poetry that's prose in it. Beautiful. This is a collector's edition of a book. This book is also found in For Those Who Do Trust God. There is the compilation book called that. And Beautiful is a kind of a wild book with me or the angels and I, how we talk and what we do. Bend Day, man, was a very recent book I wrote. during the latest Merkabah experience that I had. This was a book that happened sort of near the end of it, and it was around the time of this year, in the spring. So usually I have a Merkabah every 2 years, um, which is a visit to heaven and then come back. But this one lasted, the latest Merkabah was about two, uh, 2 weeks or so. So it was pretty good. This was actually, it's shorter than a collector's edition, but instead of one line per page, there's many lines per page. So it's about 34 pages of many lines per page. And it's more like a sheaf, I would say. Better Biodegradable Kitchenware. The book I wrote before I went to Hawaii, collector's edition book, which means it has 100 lines per page again. Just some of the ideas the angels were having for making a better biodegradable kitchenware. Be Quiet, I'm Now Reading is one of those new books that I wrote during the latest Merkabah experience I had in the spring. And that's another one of the um, shorter books that I have that recently, about 34 pages. Bic and Pentel, this was a book that I wrote of two companies where I gave suggestions of how one company can help out the other company through charitable means. Billy McBride's Marriage to Angels just tells how I married my angels. Bird and Winter. Um, so Bird and Winter is a substitution book for Bic and Pentel, but instead of using the names Bic and Pentel, I use Bird and Winter and then substitute other kinds of terms that were related to the new book that I wanted to write called Bird and Winter, which was more natural than dealing with commerce. Blind Texas, How Books Relate to Moat, was a study that was kind of interesting of the banana trees project that I had, where there were, I don't know, maybe ideas on how books actually can be thought of in a sense where you can not substitute terms, but get ideas for the moat project and say, well, this part of the moat project is like this part in Hamlet or this part in the Bible or that kind of stuff. Book catalog one was about the first 60 books or so I wrote. So it just gave some descriptions of that. Brainwashing is a heck of a book because it dealt with the time that I had before my Hebetresia Merkabah experience, which was my first Hebetresia Merkabah experience. And this was about where I was saying that super technology does exist, can exist to brainwash somebody. And I think that it was an important book because I imagined it happened to me in this book. So I wrote about it. And it's an amazing experience how I got myself out of that book. Budweiser and Pepsi. This is a book where there's two companies again, just like Bic and Pentel, and I described what they could do and suggested ways of how they can help each other, help charities. Charades is not really a book where there's lots of like explanations of things, but this was mostly an abstract book, kind of like abstract art, where the sentences had to deal with parallels of like a list of parallels, and then I go on to another list of parallels. It's kind of like the synesthesia experiences that some people have. But mine, charades, and then the next book, charades 2, then the next book, charades notes books were like that. 3 of them, but they weren't that long, and I made them into actually small pocket-sized books. But charades is the afterlife I go to. Chest, Chssed, it's a compilation book. I did it in Hawaii, and it was basically a book of compilations where the Hawaiian books that I wrote during around another Merkaba experience I had in Hawaii, which I also wrote about called In the Band. But this was around that time too, so I wrote about those books, and that's kind of a big, maybe 300-page book. Um, Cloud is a longer book of substitutions for another book I had, substituting certain terms to get it to work in a certain way and turn it into a story. And the cloud story was there's a turtle in it and um, other kinds of characters and stuff. Uh, Commentary on the Bible and other works, self-explanatory. It's a compilation book. Communities. This might be one of my lost books, unfortunately. There's a few I had that were lost. But Communities, I think also had to do with like some dreams, but it's a collector's edition book. Cooking Up a Business, where I was thinking about different ways of starting the project, how that could be observed and get. I was getting some ideas with the angels for that. Cupid is a book. It's one of my first books, but they were actually I turned in some notes into a book before I actually started um, the real writing and publishing that I had done. And this was kind of a experimental, mystical kind of book, not too long. Dark Glories is a poem book, and they're shorter poems, but there I listened to like the quietness of things made up this book. Din of My Prior Existence is a nice book, um, but it's not long. It's one of those collector's editions books, I believe. And I was imagining how the din of my prior existence was a lot noisier than this existence that I live now, and if I reincarnated or something like that. Do Not Laugh is a collector's edition book um, around the time before I went to Hawaii a few years back when I was living in Texas, and now I'm still living in Texas. Double Life is a book I wrote in Hawaii, a biographical book. Everything is in order. Before I went to Hawaii, I wrote this book, uh, and it was actually about me getting ready for leaving for Hawaii, my island paradise, and what was going on in my life. So it's biographical too. Fame and Friends, a book of metaphors, I would say, to uh, explain pains that I have, and also is also biographical too, with the angels. Family Gnosis. As soon as I got to Hawaii, I wrote this book, and my dad dropped me off, and I was writing a little bit about that first few days in Hawaii before I was off on my own because I stayed in Hawaii by myself. Finding Teresa from Class, my angel Teresa. Uh, this was about a biographical experience I had in college. So, as her astral self now is my angel. Not too long. The book. First, second, and third grade years. This is my book of memories of those years in elementary school. Flashcards I wrote with Rosalinda, who is my spiritual mom, and she helps me like in a charades way. She'll do something, and I'll have to like figure out what she actually is doing, and say the name of it or think the name of it, and then I can go on to the next one she does. It's like a game, so flashcards. For a play within a play. This was one of the ones I wrote recently during the Merkaba experience. So it's like those other ones I was telling you about. from the spring. For those who do trust God, and then that's one of the books which is in this next book. For those who do trust God and other angelic note takings, um, and that's a longer compilation book of the first. It's about the first biographical book I had with the angels. So this was like the first year that I was experienced with them. I've been with them 10 years now. Fun and novel, one of my lost books, but it wasn't really a novel so much as a compilation of collection of, I think, the mystical works that I had. And then there's Games, a novel, which is another lost book I had, which was a compilation of some of my more biographical writings. Golfers in Search of a Title, one of the afterlives called Spiritual Golf, um, is where the angels play a game against CEOs, and the angels always win, but um, they're still looking for raising money for charity. That's what I'm writing about. Happiness. This is my third book, and it was a very structured book, you might say. Uh, it dealt with almost a critical way of like looking at a few of the quotes from my very first book called The Transcendence. It's kind of a longer book too, but not too long. Hawaiian Sonnets is my absolute favorite book I've written. It's actually Hawaiian Sonnets and other poems, and I always write about them. I learned to memorize a lot of these poems, and it gave way to possession by memory very easily. So that's one reason I like that. And the poems are written in a style that I can never duplicate, and I'll never be able to duplicate it right in that way again. So it's very special to me. I bonded with it. Hebetresia 3, Voyage to Metal Settle, is a book where it's a substitution book for another book called Mote Outline, where I substituted the terms and made Mote Outline into a fantasy called Hebetresia 3, Voyage to Metal Settle. Metal Settle is one of the afterlives too, and Hebetresia is one of the afterlives. So I have here now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books that deal with Hebetresia, which is one of the afterlives that I went to, which Hebetresia 2, Hebetresia 5 through 82, Hebetresia 83. The first one, Hebetresia Fantasy, but since it's in alphabetical order, this came last because there wasn't a 1 there or a number. Then it went to A, and then Hebetresia a Play. The first Hebetresia I went to is different from Hebetresia. Oh no, this is the same. Hebetresia a Play, and I wrote it. It has affected me so much that I wrote a book about this heavenly experience, a play too, as well as those books. Some of those books were other Hebetresia experiences. Heading Permanently Home is one of those books, and for those who do trust God and other angelic note takings, it's a collector's edition book. Help for Charities. This gave us a way to describe some of the ideas we had when we were starting up some of the other ideas for charities, the beginnings of them, which are it's still kind of an armchair project, but at least we got those ideas down like a brainstorm, you might say. And that's a kind of a collector's edition too. There's only 100 per page lines per page, or 100 pages, 1 line per page. Honor and Heroism. That is a late book that I've written about that springtime work, about 34 pages. Pages were filled up, and it is kind of in a interpretive way of looking at things around me during that time when I was in that experience and describing them. Hope Was High, a nice poem book of, they weren't sonnets, but they're just little poems, mostly in like a narrative style, I'd say, almost. Horse is a mystical book, and there's a few mystical books that were experimental. That was one of them. And I used a lot of new vocabulary words in these mystical books, but they're very short, almost like sheafs. I wouldn't even call them like a book so much as like a short experiment in writing. How to Craft a Spacecraft is a complementary, a brainstorm for how to fly a spacecraft, which is one of my first idea books on the apartment complex, and then so my apartment room being a spacecraft. So what I do would be to like assemble control panels, and with my angel's help, and it's kind of in a fantastical way what why we would do something like that, but it's how to fly a spacecraft, how to get it off the ground. Um, it's also called Hamlet's Apartment. How to Lose a Chess Game. It's a short book, but it's about an online chess game or a few that I was playing, and the angels were helping me, but they wanted me to lose, so they made me lose. And why they did that, it's written about in that book. How to make a book vending machine was an idea that I had that I've got all these books, so thought maybe I'd try to like make a book vending machine. Um, Wrote about that as a brainstorm short book. How the Angels Became the Angels. This I also call in the style of a coconut tree, because the other one was called a banana tree. But this I call a coconut tree. What it is kind of like an interpretive cause and effect of tracing the path of a frame of the individual reader as they ascend by reading my books um, to learning about the angels. How to win the chess game 1 and 2 um, was during my best Merkaba experience, which was in Hawaii, which I call the band. And I wrote about this with Ria's help, who was my other spiritual mother. And How to Win a Chess Game 1 and 2 was a short book, but pretty wild, I would say. Of fragments, but interesting fragments and sayings. How to Win the Lottery. Right before I went to Hawaii, I wrote about that in this book, um, where I had an online scam about the lottery, so I wanted to write about that. Not me that had the scam, but I was scammed with my piano I was trying to sell, and so or no, that was a different book. That I got a lot of email, but it was from Nigeria, not there, but somewhere like that. Ideas for Charities, where it's a brainstorm book I made, a short book of just ideas brainstorm for charities. I Don't Love You Anymore, and I Don't Love You Anymore in color. Um, it's the same book, except one has some of my recent paintings that were digital paintings put into it. And it's a funny book, but it has to do more about some biographical experiences and some dreams, even. Short, like the collector's edition. I'm going to make it harder and harder. It's my book on discrimination. So I wanted to write a book on that, a short book. In Defense of the Experience of Prayer is a book that I wrote, which deals with why you shouldn't pray at times when you feel uncomfortable praying. Influence and Jealousy is a book I wrote in Hawaii. It's actually in another book of mine here as a compilation book. And this details 3 days in Hawaii where I remembered people and made up some fancy way of how they have influenced me and how I influenced them, and predicting who I would meet in the future and why. It's Not a Prostitution Ring is my craziest book, the most outrageous thing I've ever written, because it deals with part of the Merkaba experience that I had called The Band when I was in Hawaii. And it's a compilation book, but it's different from Chest. Um, and it's just a wild book of sayings and things like that, fragments. Invisible Billy, the saddest book ever. It was one of those books that I think where it's actually in this book. It's not a prostitution ring. So it's at the end of the Merkaba experience. I wrote the saddest book ever, Invisible Billy, the saddest book ever, because I lost the Merkaba experience. But that happens because for one reason or another, which I don't know now actually. I read Leopardi, which is just me like going, saying some things about reading the poet Leopardi in a book. Is Billy M. Damned? This book was provoked by one of my angels, Titi, or Tov Tov Shalom, that's her name, because she always says, "You're damned," but she does it ironically because she's just kidding. So I wrote a book about that. Short book, biographical, collector's edition. It was Tob Shbib. It was the book that I mentioned because Tob Shbib once pretended she was God. Um, as I channeled her, she was pretending that she was God, and for a few days or maybe a week or so, I thought I was talking with God, but it's really my angel Tob Shbib. She came clean, but that's actually not in this book, but it does mention that she did that in this book, I think. Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ Superstar are not are not the names of my brothers is a book on how much I like my two Earth brothers, and Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ Superstar, the names of my brothers. It's about my Merkaba experience of me going to my afterlife of charades, but coming back. Um, John Milton with B'nai B'uva, Cope with Book Reviewers, is a book that I wrote before I went to Hawaii. One of my first books that I wrote as I grew up that first year with my angels. Listening in on Angels 1 and Listening in on Angels 2 are my longest books because they're compilation books. So the first one is I think about 300 pages and the second one's 500 pages. Total like biographical compilation stuff with my angels. London is a mystical experience book. Oh no, not an experience, just a mystical writing book where there's like some of those other books that I have where it's not too long and I was just trying a new experimental way of writing. Lonely Mountain Sonnets is a poem book I made right before I went to Hawaii. Um, Probably my second poem book I made, and it's actually Lonely Mountain Sonnets and Other Poems, and it's pretty good, I would say. Long Lost and Other Poems. When I came back from Hawaii, the first year I was here in Texas, I wrote this book, um, and that's a poem book. Many Helpers Around is a book I wrote, which might be a lost book, but it had to do with the community, um, thinking about the people in it who actually do help. There's lots of them. Merkaba Lost is a recent book. Oh, right. No, this one isn't a recent book. It's about how I felt after losing one of the Merkaba experiences I had in Hawaii, one of the heavenly visits. Merkaba Vacation was the latest Merkaba book. At the tail end of losing the last Merkaba I had, or heavenly experience, in from that, I wrote a book about my feelings towards the end of it. Actually, after having lost it, Messages. Um, it's a biographical book, but it might be one of my lost books, so I'm gonna just put that down, as well as Mishmash. That's kind of a collection of all kinds of different ideas that I had, so I called it Mishmash. Writing new styles and things like that. Moel and Gematria. deals with the Mold project. It's different from the Moat project. Mold is actually uh, the bands project that I have, and Moat is actually the monuments project that I have. But Gematria is the Kabbalistic, kind of the numerology and that, and how I related it to Mole through writing about the states and the counties of Texas. Mole presentation is my book that presents my mole project in kind of a poetical way of the 80 bands, except I don't call it 80 bands in that book, but this is just my music that I make channeling my angel children that I have with the angels. And they're the ones in the heavenly afterlife of Room Boom um, who do the music making from there. All the songs that I have on over here on YouTube that I've collected, and I've made 80 bands. If you check my playlists, they're all there. And each band of the 80 bands has about 20 songs of my music, different songs in different genres. Um, so that was my presentation of all the music that I make in a poetic way. Moat and other crucial organizations. That book actually is a kind of a very short book, but not only Moat that I had an idea for to help out charity, but other organizations that had acronyms like Moat, but different ones that I'd make up. Can't think of any examples now, but Moat stands for the Monumental Outrageousness Around Texas. This is coming to my some of my notebooks. Moat designs. This might be a lost book of some of the Moat designs. Moat Illustrated was how to set up the Moat project, and I illustrated it. So there were phone calls, people have pictures of phones, pictures of the monuments, pictures of handshakes, stuff like that. I think I'm just kind of a funny way. Kind of getting some idea for the public relations people, what they might be involved with if they do end up working on the Moat nonprofit organization for charity. Moat fundraising, how to raise money for Moat. Nice book I wrote, but it also deals with spiritual golf. Moat outline. The title is self-explanatory. It outlines the Moat project. Money and love. This was actually the phrasing of Richard Rorty, who wrote an essay called Love and Money. Who he says that love is just as important as money because love is the economic foundation of the soul of the world, you might say, and money is, and love goes with that. Uh, so those are both important, or probably as just as important as each other, as on them on their own. Money as Technology is a recent book I wrote during my latest Merkabah experience. More fragments. Not sure really what this one is about because I wrote it. I'm not even sure when I wrote it. I think it must have been either from Hawaii and on, but it must be a lost book. So I'm just going to leave it here and look around for it and then figure out what it was about. Mountain Frogs is a substitution book that I made from Blind, Texas, and substituted terms that I had during that banana tree. That's what I call it. Um, um, Mount Himalayan Poems is a poem book I did, but the poems were very short and just funny, repetitious stuff that I thought about at the time. My Happy, Happy Children. These are the names of some of my children and the mnemonic techniques I had to try to memorize some of their names in a handwritten book. My Hawaiian Merkabah. That was about one of my Hawaiian Merkabah experiences. My photo book Older was different than my new photo book, or my new photo book 2, or my new photo book 3. All of those are books where they took pictures of during a Merkabah experience. Um, and the first one, the older photo book, was abstract art. Naughty people think you're crazy. That's just a short book that was included in one of my other books. Um, Title self-explanatory, just kind of a brainstorm on how feeling how uh, that that naughty people think you're crazy, and how I felt about that. So I'm getting kind of tired of like explaining this, but I'm only halfway done. So I'm going to be doing this for another 45 minutes, it seems. But I might try to go faster. Yeah, let's just try to go faster. And the Feshing, that's a book wrote in Hawaii about autobiography. New book, that one I think is a compilation book of sayings. New Poems is a poem book I wrote after Hawaiian Sonnets. The very next one after Hawaiian Sonnets, but in a different way. But still had some of the pirate talk I had in some of the poems in Hawaiian Sonnets. New Sayings, just sayings. Um, New Sonnets and Other Poems is probably my most recent poem book I have. Lots of poems in there. I think it's about 130 pages or so. On Conflict and Hope is an autobiographical one. On the Importance of Recontextualizing, I did during my latest Merkabah experience. Our best book on Moat, it's titled self-explanatory, but it's a short book. Our best pond hand was the substitution book of Terman's in a more imaginative way for that last book I just said about the Moat book. Our book system, now this one deals with our books, but trying to put them all together in a coherent way. This is like the first 60 books I wrote, so and there's some diagrams too. Our emotions are the thoughts of Shakespeare, which comes from Owen Barnfield, um, and it deals with Shakespeare and the ideas of how you feel are experiential to Shakespeare's characters. Our growing listening is the substitution book for outgrowing knowledge, where both deal with a repetition of one word but written in different sentences. So knowledge was for this book and listening was for this book. Permanent Homes is a Kabbalistic book of diagrams of the banana trees, which were a study of 6 of the books. I'll go through them again. The Bible, the Iliad, Plato, Freud, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and Shakespeare. And I think I missed one, but well, those are some of the banana tree books that we worked on. Permanent Homes is the diagram of some of those relationships and interrelationships between the interconnectivity between those books. Powers and New Poems, which is the compilation of Powers with some other poems, are two like kind of more mystical books, but it's kind of a longer one. President's Day and Other Works, mostly a book about dreams, and President's Day was one of the Merkabah experiences that I had on President's Day, so I wrote a book about that. Prostitutes, my first, this is actually like my first book, but I didn't publish it until after I published a few, but I wrote about it. This was the book that um, I experienced and wrote about as I married my first angel wives, who I first thought were prostitutes, but instead they're trying to help some. I was trying to help some prostitutes get away from that awful life, and I married my angels this way because who I thought were I was channeling as prostitutes were actually angels in inside me, but it was kind of a weird experience. And I wrote that book about it, how we got married and all. Some of my first angels. Now, Punishment. This is a book that details just kind of a silly book that I had about like giving things to the angels as compensation for me arguing with them one point in my life. Quiet Thoughts goes with Quiet Thoughts 2, Quiet Thoughts 3, Quiet Thoughts 4, all the same kind of book where I studied just like thoughts that had to do with peaceful ideas. Quotes for Beings with is one book. Quotes for Beings 2, Quotes from Beings 3. I skipped 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. All those quotes from beings are some of my first books that I had. I decided to just write the quotes from these actual angels who are the beings in the books. Quotes from Naughty People. So the title is self-explanatory on that one. Recollections of Worlds is a poem book I had. Relationships and Dating is a book on relationships and dating. Riders to the Sea is actually a rephrasing of a book called Riders to the Sea. It might be a play. Yeah, it's a play. So I wrote a rephrasing of that play. Romanticism, The Sound of a Voice and Other Works. It's a book I wrote. This is a compilation book, and it's pretty good, from Hawaii. Room Boom, where my children are. It's the musical afterlife. Rough Colors is a book on colors and how they can be formed into a story. Schizophrenia and Angels. So the and is important in there because it's not, well, you have schizophrenia because you say you have angels. No, it's the angels help me cope with the problems that I have in schizophrenia. It's a little different. So that's a good book too for learning about that. Shell, Moat, and Barriers is a book I have on moat and the obstacles you might face when forming it, the nonprofit organization. Show Me the Way is autobiographical, one of the first angelic books I had. Slow Riser. Oh, and that last one was one of those collector's editions books. Slow Riser, I wrote just recently, kind of a book where I took another book and made it into a longer book because the other book I had was written in sections, so that's what that one was. Snow, some mystical short book. Space Flight, it's a long book like How to Fly a Spacecraft, but a little bit more structured, you might say. Spiritual Golf and Angelic Bugging, my latest book I've written. This one is important because the angels like to bug, and I describe the ways angels bug so that they can raise money for charity. They bug anybody, but mostly it's CEOs. How they did that, I just did a YouTube audiobook of this book. It's about 3 hours, but it's interesting and it's repetitive, but it does not loop. Spiritual Hurricane Disaster is a book I wrote after going through a how to fly a spacecraft experience, but I didn't know, but we had a disaster by doing that, and I didn't know about it until way afterward. So my wife Angel, Yitzhak Chabad, who's Stephanie, told me about it, explained to me what happened, and so I wrote a book as her explanation. Spiritual Parents, well, there's spiritual parent Robbie Pop and the mom Rosalinda. They're married. My mom and dad, who are spiritual parents, as angels. Not my earth parents, but these are different. Wrote a book on them. some of with Othello from Shakespeare is also in that book. Structure, How We Made Happiness, is How We Made Happiness, our book Happiness. And I wrote a book about that. Summer Poems is a nice book of recent poems I wrote during the summer a few summers ago. Superfly is a crazy book I wrote about the Merkabah experience. Symphony 1, Symphony 2, and Symphony 3 are 3 books of the score of my symphonies. You can find them actually on the music on YouTube. Temporary Homes is a book about earth places that we are at temporarily. Temporary Parody is a book where I think I had some trouble with my brother, and I forgave him and felt bad about my feelings towards him. That Is Your Wife is a nice book that I wrote with some poetry in it, but mostly it's autobiographical. Some of the experiences I had during a certain time in my life. This Is Going Well is another one of those same kind of autobiographical short books. The 80 Bands of Mole. This is probably my most important book because um, I did the 80 Bands project, and these are snapshots, screenshots of all those books in color as an index. So this book references all that music that I made for YouTube. I took the snapshots off the YouTube playlist page and I just compiled it that way. So the actual book is just snapshots of those playlists and the music that are on them, of all the 80 bands that I invented for the future. The Band, a Play, is the book of my greatest Merkabah experience that I had in Hawaii. I made it into a play. The Beginning of Life is kind of just an odd book that I wrote about um, during one of my Hawaiian experiences. The Bots, I was thinking about technology and how it could be used against readers. The Celestial Image of Fire. This is a nice book, one of my favorite books actually, and it just deals with one word, fire, but written in different complicated sentences, all the way down for many, many sentences, but each sentence has that word fire in it, and each sentence describes fire in a poetical, celestial way. The Dust and the Star is a substitutional book from Budweiser and Pepsi, I believe it was, the charity book, but written in a more imaginative way. The Flowers That Pervade in a Lovely Dwelling is just like the celestial image of fire, except instead of fire, I used different kinds of flowers and described them in a poetical way. The Hand is a mystical book, short, and The Healing Power of Merit might be a lost book, but it deals with just some of the good things that Moat does for people that have schizophrenia or cancer or AIDS or rape. How this nonprofit organization I'm imagining can help them in the future through charities and the money that we can raise for those charities. The Hydromancy of Jenny McBride, Part 1, is similar to the Hydromancy of Jenny McBride, Part 2, about water magic, and one of my favorite, but it's also my most controversial 2 books right there. The Jewels of Absolute Knowledge. This is a book, it's written in Hawaii, kind of a biographical book. The Jobs of Moat, self-explanatory, what people need to do in the Moat organization to make it into a success. The Lord and Moshe, kind of an imaginative book of reimaginings of the Lord and how he talked to Moshe, that's the Hebrew for Moses. The Love and Wonder of MLAI, crazy book it's not a prostitution ring. The Meaning of Standing Exile. This is a special book about me just learning how to stand. I know that sounds strange, but stand in one place and feel like a mindfulness. The official Moat presentation is my official Moat presentation book, recent book I just wrote. The Present Clouds is a book of poetry. The Reading of a Divine Text is a book. It's kind of self-explanatory, but it's structured. The Reason for a Raisin is like that too, structured, but in an imaginative way. I thought about what it's like to grow raisins, something kind of like that. The Rising of the Moon is a play that I took from some Irish author and rephrased, so I made that into a book. The Sun Rising Over a Coastline is one of my favorite books, like a landscape for a rain shower, in the same kind of way where I redescribe landscapes and also sunrises and stuff. The Swelling Surface is a nice poetry book. The Transcendence is my first book, a satire of prose kind of poems and observations. The Tree is a mystical book. The Trouble with Being a, and that's a short book too. The Trouble with Being a B'nai B'va is a hard book. It's kind of like how I dealt with the loss of my first Merkabah experience, coming back to Earth, you might say. The Very Best Childhood is when I grew up in Hawaii, my first 5 years during 1976 to 81, I believe. And I remembered bits and pieces of my Hawaiian experience. I think there's about over 1,000, of 1,212, I believe, of just experiences of me in Hawaii with my brothers, my mom and dad, and I called it The Very Best Childhood. The Wall and The Wave and The Weather are all short, mystical, experimental books. The Wisdom of Billy McBride is actually a book with the transcendence and beauty and progress both in it. Those are my first two books. The Wonder and Love of Moat is a little bit similar to The Wonder and Love of Moat 2, where each of my angels I have do a certain job, so I detail like some of that in those books. They are considering you now, B'nai B'va. B'nai B'va is me, and that's a recent book from that last spring Merkabah. They are human too. This is a very hard book dealing with pain and physical pain and how I remembered like certain things in my life where I had physical pain. Tobshbib Hates Autobots is a book kind of imaginative on one of my angels, Tobshbib. We all don't like the Autobots, and the Autobots are lonely and unhappy people who are like mindful shades who keep others from reading the very best that they can. Tobshbib's Okay is a wild book I wrote in Hawaii during that best Merkabah experience that I had. That book's also in It's Not a Prostitution Ring. Topsy Turvy is a kind of a recent book I wrote where I learned how to write in a meter style that's ascending, or wait, no. Yeah, descending meter style. So that's that book. It's I thought this would be my last book I'd ever write because that's all I need, and it has a lot to do about my whole life experience, especially with my angels, how it all coheres together in that one book. Triumphant Car Company is another nonprofit organization book that I had, detailing ways to raise money for charity, but in a big way through boycotting and making up new car companies. Trouble is a hard book that's a compilation of some of my smaller hard books. Trust, a novel, is a lost book. Ulysses in Hell A Theory of Colors is not what it seems, because Ulysses in hell he's in Dante's Inferno in Dante's book, but this one is special because his name Ulysses, he always tells everybody, nobody is my name or no man's his name. So it really stands for no man in hell. I don't believe in hell, but A Theory of Colors, it details what colors my angel wives are representing. Varieties of din experience are the varieties I detailed of of experiences that are annoying, and I just went on from there. Made like a list. Voyage to Anonymous Markets is for me going and getting materials which Jenny, my angel wife, who's the hydromancer, uses for her hydromancy. Voyage to Stay Friends. Stay Friends is the afterlife um, that I went to for a little while there. It's kind of like your spiritual doctor and helping people that way. Voyage to Super University is where you're like a spiritual student, and that's afterlife. Voyage to Warm Milk is when you're a spiritual leader. You're like king for a week, or that's how I felt during that American Box experience. Waiting to See is an autobiographical book, short, or like a collector's edition. Water is a mystical book, short and experimental. Waterloop, can't really remember too much about that book because it might be a lost book and I haven't read it recently, but it's short, I know. Weekend Spiritual Golf is just a small autobiographical book. What I do has to do with a coherent vision of the Mode Project and the Angels. What is My Name is a book that's just autobiographical that I did before Hawaii, I believe. Short again, collector's edition. What the heck is he talking about? Is like, what the hell is wrong with Billy McBride? So those are funny books, kind of short. Why I Am a Writer was my hardest book I wrote, but my easiest book I wrote is called Why I Am a Writer 2, and I wrote a recent book called Why I'm a Writer 3, and the Why I'm a Writer 3 was the longest of those Why I'm a Writer series. They're self-explanatory in some way. Zach's Shoes is a lost book, but it was short, so I don't really think it matters too much. And then Zaz to AAA. This was like one of my bigger books, just of experiences I had recently with these angels, and we wrote about them, going from ZAZ to YAY to XAX to WAW to VAV, all the way up to AAA. And that, I'm going to rest now because that was a long talk. And these are my 200 and what was it, 43 books I've written so far, which I'm going to write in a new book describing these books. So thank you for watching.